Section 7. 30.
We historians have a responsibility to historical facts in general, and for criticizing the abuse of history in particular. I need say little about the first of these responsibilities. I would not have to say anything but for two developments. One is the current fashion for novelists to base their plots on recorded reality, rather than inventing them, thus fudging the border between historical fact and fiction. The other is the rise of postmodernist intellectual fashions in universities, particularly in departments of literature and anthropology, which imply that all facts claiming objective existence are simply intellectual constructions. In short, that there is no clear difference between fact and fiction. But there is. And for historians, the ability to distinguish between the two is absolutely fundamental. We cannot invent our facts. Either Elvis Presley is dead or he isn't. The question can be answered unambiguously on the basis of evidence, insofar as reliable evidence is available.
31.
In a speech delivered at the University of Oxford in 1957, British historian Hugh Trevor Roper said there are two essential functions of human history: to be useful and to be controversial. According to him, history that cannot teach lessons to those in the present is nothing more than a diamond in the rough. And history that is not controversial is completely dead, for no subject is more open to interpretation than history. By its very nature, human history is a subject that cannot be unbiased or factual. It is the study of man's past, specifically the past that is relevant to the present. But the past is mute, and so it doesn't tell us much at all. We can only try to analyze and reconstruct it on the basis of the records and evidence that have been preserved in one form or another. And this is where the controversial aspects of history arouse and provoke us. The analyses made by historians and the conclusions they come to are all based on their own personal interpretations, which are based on their own individual beliefs.
32.
A. Some historians emphasize the necessity of constructing formulas in history. They insist that it is possible to ascertain historical laws and draw meaningful lessons from them, much the same as we do with scientific laws, such as the laws of Kepler, the laws of wave theory, and so on. A historical law might specify that whenever X happens, Y is certain to follow, so that, for instance, whenever a nation's resources are insufficient to maintain its population, that nation turns to war is a historical law. For those who suppose that it is meaningful to talk of such laws, systematic historical investigation would be the way to validate the claim. B. Can anyone show that history develops according to historical laws? Karl Popper, one of the greatest social and political philosophers of 20th century, doubts it. According to him, the error lies in assuming that history is similar to science, when in fact it differs greatly. Scientific laws apply to closed systems, whereas history, which is composed of the actions of many individuals, is neither closed nor even a system at all. Moreover, since the growth of scientific knowledge affects human behavior and hence history, the use of scientific laws to predict history is only possible if we can also predict the growth of the scientific knowledge. If we could do that, however, we would already know it. As a result, there can be no historical laws.
33.
Have you ever heard that history is the story of the winners? If this is true, what should be considered is not just the accuracy of history textbooks, but the actual influence that goes along with being the ones who get their story heard. It is the history of the dominant group that gets to be told, and it is their story that is often the one that becomes normalized, while the stories of everyone else get othered or ignored. Minority groups and outcasts in society don't get to tell their side of the story. A classic example is the history of the stolen generation in Australia. Until recently, the fact that 100,000 Aboriginal children were taken from their families and raised in the homes of white families was not considered an important part of European history in Australia, and so there was no way for those to whom it happened to tell their story. Only with the increasing rise of pluralism in Australia has it become possible for members of the stolen generation to speak out and be heard by the general public. Because history is ultimately linked to power, it is extremely difficult to develop ways of using and managing resources when the historical stories make the owners of those resources invisible. Consider the Penan people of the Borneo rainforest. As long as these people go unrecognized, it is a legitimate activity to cut down their forests and sell their timber to first world nations. It is also legitimate to ensure that the profits from such activity flow directly to the lumber companies, without any recognition being given to the Penan for their prior ownership of the trees.
"34. The early 19th century constituted a period of massive migration in the United States as white settlers moved westward in droves. The U.S. government enacted the forced relocation of Native American tribes to government-established reservations, but continued settlement further raised the demand for land. However, the Native American practice of communal use of land made it nearly impossible to acquire reservation land from tribes. The avarice of settlers and the government for ever-increasing control of land ultimately led to the General Allotment Act of 1887, often referred to as the Dawes Act, as the legislation was sponsored by Senator Henry Dawes. Under the Dawes Act, land that had previously been held collectively by tribes was parceled out into allotments and then distributed to individual members of the tribe. The territory of the reservations was not fully distributed, however, and the remaining surplus, often the most well-positioned or mineral-rich land, was sold off to the highest bidder, who was usually a non-Indian settler or company. The division of communal lands forced Native Americans to assimilate into mainstream American culture, leading to the unwitting abdication of tribal sovereignty and the loss of cultural identity. The dramatic shift in lifestyle for Native Americans, moving from working together as a closely tied community to individually cultivating small farms, was not only unwanted, but also unfeasible. Many plots allotted to Native Americans were ill-suited for farming on a small scale, and those caring for the land lacked basic agricultural necessities. The allotment system was abolished in 1934, but its far-reaching adverse effects are still felt today. This is evidenced by the significant changes that the Indian way of life has undergone, and the fact that some reservations still have more non-Indian than Indian residents.